Banks, however, did have his friendly witnesses.
Your name is Mr. Rogie McLaughlin.
That's right.
And you are president of Canada Steamship Lines Limited?
That's right.
Mr. Dunkley of your company has told us that by and large your relationship with the SIU has been of a fairly highly satisfactory one over the years. Do you agree with that?
No, that's true.
And apart from some isolated situation in 1954, you have not had any strikes.
No, I think that is correct.
I think it's only fair to say, Mr. McLaughlin, that your relationship with the SIU is unique in the sense that it is a good relationship that has developed as compared with the other major lake carriers.
Yes, I can't speak for the other major lake carriers. I'm only concerned with myself.
Do you know about the DNS list?
I beg your pardon?
The DNS list that the SIU had.
The do not ship list.
Oh, yes. Well, the only thing I know about that is what I read in the papers. Seems to me perhaps the
Are
press
you
has been...
telling me, Mr. McLaughlin, that you never received copies, that your company never received copies of the DNS list from the SIU?
Well, they may have, but I didn't. I don't know anything about it.
I believe you endorsed Mr. Banks. You do know Mr. Hal Banks.
As far as I'm concerned, we've always had very favorable relations with Mr. Banks.
You are Mr. Howard Heineman, president of Heineman Transportation Company.
Yes, that's right.
How long had Captain Watson been with your company?
Started working for my father in 1936.
A good man?
Yes.
They're not easy to get, are they? Captains of lakes vessels.
Good ones, I guess, are few and far between.
Have you read this letter written to the Owen Sound newspaper by Captain Watson?
Yes.
Would you agree that in it, Captain Watson objects strenuously to the fact that Mr. Banks, a convicted felon, has been granted landed immigrant status in Canada? Now, Mr. Heineman, this is a captain in a free country giving his opinion in a matter that interested him. Is that right?
Yes, sir, that's right.
Yet he was directed by your company to apologize to Mr. Banks. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't say he was directed. It was suggested.
Let me read you Captain Watson's second letter. Quote, Dear Mr. Banks, in regards to a letter I wrote about 2 months ago to the newspaper in Owen Sound, Ontario, in this letter I made some disparaging remarks about you, for which I now send my sincere and humble apologies. I was foolish enough to go into print with my opinions and must now offer my apology. This, along with my avowal to refrain from any comments about you or anybody else, is all I can offer to you in the way of reparation. My job and my family's welfare depend now entirely on your mercy. I hope you will accept my apology and in your benevolence, allow me to keep my job so I can keep my family. If there is anything I can do to square this with you, I will most earnestly do so. Yours very sincerely, J.M. Watson, unquote. Did Captain Watson have any discussion with your firm before he wrote this letter?
No.
Well, just a moment ago, you said it was suggested.
Well, it was suggested, but he just asked if there'd been any discussion about this letter.
It was suggested he write an apology.
Yes, as a result of a telephone call from my father.
To Captain Watson?
Yes.
Well, there must have been some complaint from Mr. Banks.
Yes, there was.
Captain Watson must have been in a frantic state.
Well, he must have been to write a letter like that, but he was in no danger of losing his job.
He imagined it?
Yes, he did.
If the ship owners were being embarrassed, so were most of Canada's labor leaders.
Mr. Claude Jodoin.
They had known of Banks' brutality. They had known there was no real democracy in his union. Yet most of them had gone along for the sake of labor solidarity, for the sake of their American connections.
Truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Well, Mr. Jaudoin, we turn to your relationship with Mr. Banks.
Well, you know, Mr. Dubbin, nobody is perfect in this world. And we all make errors. I make errors.
Well, I'm going to talk about one of them now.
Yes, good.
Now, when Mr. Banks applied for citizenship in the latter part of 1957 or 1958, he managed to rally behind him, even at that late date, some very well-known names in organized labor. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, that he did.
Now, according to the Citizenship Court judgment, you were reported as saying that, in your view, Mr. Banks was a man of good character. And from a business point of view, he was an homme actif pour le Canada, an active man for Canada.
Well, that's what I thought at that time.
Well, that was very, very high applause for this man.
That's right. And that is why I told you, Mr. Dubbin, when I make error, I make a good one.
Thank you for moving your convention from Hawaii to Montreal. A show of strength at this point will do us a lot of good.
As the commission went into its fourth month, Banks was marshaling all the support he could get. He had publicly smeared Claude Jaudoin as a communist fellow traveler. He had started to mount a campaign to discredit the Norris Commission as a communist-inspired hatchet job. When the court asked the SIU for its documents and files, there were delays and excuses. But when the do-not-ship lists were finally produced, there was documentation to prove that at least 6,000 men had unjustly lost their jobs. The misuse of union funds, which might have shocked another hearing, actually provided light relief.
And on February 1959, there was an expenditure of $2,896.70. I suggest to you that was to produce a shiny new white Cadillac.
Yes, a big, long one.
A long one.
That's right.
Now, February 1960, we have an expenditure of $3,034.70. What color was that one?
I think that one was white, too.
That was white.
That's right.
January 1961, $3,427.30 for a white Cadillac. They were a little shorter that year, weren't they?
It had 4 wheels and it was white.
4 wheels and it was white.
That's right. I drove a Cadillac for a long time, down in San Francisco and in the States, and I didn't see any reason why I should...
Lower your standards.
That's correct. And I do not now.
Well, what about this young woman who was living in your house? You told us that you paid her certain money.
Yes.
Was that in cash or by check?
It was sometimes by check, sometimes in cash.
And were those SIU of Canada
No, they
checks,
were
or were
not.
they yours?
They were mine.
They were yours.
That's right.
And so no monies were paid to this woman out of the funds of the SIU of Canada?
Well, she did work for the SIU several years ago, but since that time she's been working for me as my housekeeper and my nurse.
Is she a registered nurse?
No, she is not.
She's a practical nurse.
Yes.
Where did she get her training?
I believe she worked at nursing in Montreal.
Where?
I don't know, Mr. Wright.
You might think I'm facetious, but may I ask you, are you a vain man? Do you like looking at yourself all the time?
No, I do not.
What do you need 14 mirrors in an apartment for?
There was a need for them.
$1,082 just for mirrors?
That's right.
Well, I put it to you, Mr. Banks, that this is a grossly extravagant use of union funds.
Mr. Dubbin, I guarantee you that we got $1 worth of value for every dollar we spent to advance the cause of the Union.
Now came time for the documentation of physical violence. The commission had evidence of 150 separate beatings in the last 12 months alone, but many of the victims were afraid to appear. Witnesses did testify in 32 of these beatings, but none of them could remember much. It became evident it would be very difficult to pin any of them on Hal C. Banks.
As I turned, I just got a glimpse of a man, about 6'4" or 5". He was taller than I was. I could look up to him. Heavy build, and the fist that he hit me with, it was like a football.
Captain Bissett, could you tell me, is this a pretty accurate picture of the way you looked at the time?
It is an accurate picture.
Are you saying to me that the people who came to this commission and said they were beaten up had not been beaten up?
I would say that some of them weren't. And I would say that some of them were psychopaths. And I would put them in that category with respect to the question as to who beat them up.
We know, and we have the evidence of a Captain Bissett who has been an employee of Upper Lakes for many years.
I don't know what the hell they were, barroom brawls or what they were.
He was beaten up in a department store.
I have seen captains beat up, and I've seen captains beat people up several times in my career on the waterfront. There could be 100 reasons for it. I've seen captains running out of an apartment house with an irate husband on their necks, etc. I do not see how the SIU could have been involved in this. You're misinformed and you're wrong.
In a very short time, people, many of them, have been very badly beaten, not on picket lines, but sought out in their homes, in restaurants, or on the streets. All these people who say they didn't have anyone who could have it in for them, oh no. The only explanation they could give was that it must have something to do with the dispute between the SIU and Upper Lakes. I've only told you a part of it, but wouldn't you call that organized violence and mayhem?
I would not call it that at all.
All counsel is asking you is, did you know this violence existed?
I do not know that it existed. I have not seen one single case of it, and I have never heard of any conviction in regard to it.
Never mind convictions.
You said counsel wanted to know if I knew anything about it.
And you say no.
I say no.
Captain Walsh, what were the relations between your guild and the SIU?
The SIU were trying to organize the deck officers. They were raiding our memberships.
Well, sir, I think 2 or 3 days before I was beat, I had called my office in Montreal regarding some other business of the guild. And at the end of my conversation, I was told by my superior to be careful.
Could you tell if there was one assailant or more than one?
Well, it's hard to say, sir, because when I was struck, I was knocked down, and when I was down, the boots were put to me, and I don't know whether it was 1 or 2 or 10, I couldn't tell you.
Were they tall or short?
No, they were big, whatever it was. I felt by the way I was being kicked around that it was not by a little boy, because I've been around a little bit, mister, and I knew that it was either more than one or perhaps really big people who were doing it. But I lost teeth. I had all the skin kicked off my leg and back and arms. My only thought was to get off the ground. If I could get off the ground, I perhaps could live. I cleaned myself up, and when I came down, the police were there. And they didn't seem to be too interested.
You know what I've been thinking? I've been thinking we may have that son of a bitch. We have a witness to the planning of the beating, and we hear from him tomorrow.
Greaves.
I believe Dick Greaves. My experience on the bench tells me to believe a man who implicates himself.
I was at that time living at a small town in Ontario, and the chief of police of that town came to me and said, "I've been called from Ottawa. You seem to be a very important witness, and I have orders to give you all the protection that you require." And I said to him, "Well, Chief, you know, how can you protect me if they're going to bring professional people in from the U.S., and this is exactly what the history was, Banks always got the professional in, then you would have to surround me with police, and they'd have to live in my bedroom and bathroom and everywhere else."
But the police successfully mounted a 24-hour guard on Dick Greaves, and he arrived sound in mind and body.
Mr. Greaves, do you have any direct evidence that Mr. Banks was involved in any of the beatings we've discussed?
I have direct knowledge of one such beating, the beating of Captain Walsh. I was present when Banks ordered Casper and Richardson to beat him up.
What did he say, precisely?
He said they should put a head on him.
Did you instruct Mr. Casper to go and beat up Captain Walsh?
No. Greaves and Woods were telling an untruth. I have heard that story many times before, and I am not yet sure whether he was ever beaten up. As a matter of fact, it has not really been important enough for me to really investigate whether
I
he was
would think
beaten
that
up.
it would be very important to you, particularly if you are alleged to have arranged for it or inspired
I
it.
did not arrange it, and I did not inspire it. Captain Walsh and I had no trouble. As a matter of fact, a very short time prior to the time that Captain Walsh was supposed to have been done in, he was in my office, and I did Captain Walsh a favor with regard to his son.
Yes, he told us about that.
And furthermore, I do not operate on that level. I have been in the union business for too long to operate on that level.
Well, what do you mean by that level?
On a level of violence.
And that's the best answer that you can give us?
It's a responsible statement by a responsible trade union leader.
The hearings had lasted 8 months. 190 witnesses had been heard. Mr. Justice Norris now retired to consider 4.5 million words of testimony.
The Norris Commission report isn't in yet, but one thing is for certain. There is more violence ahead on Canada's waterfronts. He ain't kidding. Oh, look at this. Listen to this. Banks, as a witness, was bombastic, cunning, and charming.
Charming.
That's me.
Jesus, who wrote that shit?
Some guy called Gazowski.
Well,
Not bad for a Polak.
I just hope that Judge Norris will be as kind as Mr. Gozowski.
After 107 days of testimony, we reached certain inescapable conclusions. What all this is about, the lawlessness, the unlawful picketing, the intimidation here and in the U.S., all this was not to right any wrong, still less to assist seamen. It is simply part of an irresponsible campaign to maintain one rapacious and violent man, Harold Chamberlain Banks, in power as a dictator. Banks is capable, decisive, egocentric, intolerant, and ruthless. He is of the stuff of the Capones and the Hoffas. He is a bully, cruel, dishonest, greedy, power-hungry, and contemptuous of the law. In his mouth, the use of the word democracy is sheer blasphemy. For him, the big lie and the failure to remember are ever-ready weapons and shields. It was at any time within the power of Canada Steamship Lines, the largest shipping company on the Great Lakes, with all its strength and influence, to accomplish much by taking a positive stand on the side of law and order. They not only did nothing, but gave support to Banks, the lawbreaker. In this generally law-abiding country where we boast of our culture and our freedom, decent citizens were afraid to walk the streets and were afraid to take a stand in support of their rights. Witnesses came to give evidence, still bearing the marks of beatings. Some were crippled or marked for life. Others were afraid to give evidence before the inquiry because of the threat of violence, expressed or implied. This was Banks' mentality, a gangster mentality. And in his personal history, we can see the circumstances that might have contributed to his brutalization. Prison, and a generally harsh existence during his formative years. But what are we to say of those who supported and protected him here and in the United States? Respected businessmen, labor leaders, and above all, politicians. They have no such justifying circumstances in their past. And yet, they aided and abetted him at every turn, and thus share in the responsibility for his crimes.
Two on the side, in the back. One, move. Okay, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good, Al. Come on.
Oh, hey, we got visitors. Come on in, boys. My door is open.
Harold Banks?
You know goddamn well who I am.
We have a warrant for your arrest.
Don't you boys ever learn? Come on in. Have a drink while I call a mouthpiece.
We'll wait here.
My. I never got mad at Captain Wolf.
Hal Banks was brought before the Quebec Court of Sessions of the Peace, charged with criminally conspiring to cause bodily harm to one Captain Henry Francis Walsh.
Reeves fabricated the story from whole cloth.
Same applies to Mr. Sheehan's testimony?
It does. I swear it before God.
The testimony of Banks and his associates did not impress the court.
I play a little cards now and then.
You play a little card.
Yeah, I do. You do want me to tell the truth, don't you?
Banks was duly convicted and brought in for sentencing.
Harold Chamberlain Banks, you have been found guilty of conspiring to cause bodily harm. The court can find no mitigating circumstances. I therefore sentence you to 5 years penal servitude. Your counsel has requested bail pending an appeal. The court grants this request and sets bail at $25,000 cash.
Hal? Hal?
Citizenship?
I'm an American citizen.
You've been in Canada on business?
A little business, a little pleasure.
You going back up?
No, I don't think so.
Nice car.
Gets me around.
Have a good trip.
Thank you.
When Hal Banks jumped bail, he had good reason not to worry. The charge on which he was convicted was non-extraditable. The province of Ontario decided to lay a perjury charge against Banks. This was an extraditable offense. After 4 years of legal argument, a New York judge finally issued an order of extradition. The Manhattan Detention Center, 1968. In 4 hours, Hal Banks would be escorted back to Canada.
Nice place you got here. Gentlemen, if you don't mind, your prisoner has to make pee-pee.
Once again, Hal Banks had good reason not to worry.
Is this gonna get intimate?
At the 11th hour, the American Secretary of State himself, Dean Rusk, quashed the extradition order. When asked later why he had taken this extraordinary action, he said he had done it at the request of a Canadian cabinet minister. The SIU, which had been temporarily under trusteeship, was returned to the old management. A close pal of Banks, Leonard McLaughlin, described by Norris as an unscrupulous liar, took over as president. The present incumbent is another of Banks's protégés, Roman Grolowitz. In 1984, some union members challenged Mr. Grolowitz's leadership. One critic, this man, Donald Davis, was beaten to a pulp outside the Union Hall. Mr. Banks himself moved back to San Francisco. He set himself up in the business of ferrying harbor pilots. He ran his boat for some 20 years. At age 75, he died of natural causes.